The Arizona sun hammered down on forward operating base Sentinel like a vengeful god. Staff Sergeant Marcus Webb sat alone at the edge of the mess hall, his weathered hands wrapped around a dented metal canteen that looked like it had survived 2 wars. At 62, he was the oldest soldier on the base, a late-career enlistee who had joined after his wife passed and his farm went under. The younger troops called him Grandpa when they were being nice, and Old Man River when they weren't. Lieutenant Jake Morrison watched from across the courtyard, shaking his head as he turned to his squad. The golden boy from West Point, 26 years old with a jawline that could cut glass and a record spotless enough to eat off. Morrison leaned back in his chair, his voice carrying just enough for Webb to hear. See that? 3 months and the fossil still carries that piece of junk everywhere. My grandmother's got better gear in her attic. Corporal Danny Chun snorted, wiping sweat from his forehead. What's the deal with that thing anyway? Looks like he pulled it out of a dumpster behind a pawn shop. Webb didn't look up. His fingers traced the rust spots on the canteen's surface, each one a memory. The canteen had belonged to his father, who had carried it through Vietnam. Before that, his grandfather had it in Korea. The metal was pitted and scarred, the green paint mostly gone, replaced by oxidation and time. But it still held water, and that was all that mattered to Marcus Webb. Private First Class Sarah Mendez, fresh out of basic training at Fort Benning, glanced between Morrison and Webb. She had only been at Sentinel for 2 weeks, still trying to figure out the social landscape. Sir, maybe he just likes having something from home. My mom sent me her old rosary. Morrison's laugh was sharp. A rosary serves a purpose, Mendez. That rusty death trap probably gives you tetanus just looking at it. I've seen homeless people in Phoenix carrying better water bottles. The group laughed, and Webb finally stood, his knees cracking audibly in the desert quiet. He was 6'3" but moved like someone carrying invisible weight. His uniform was immaculate despite its age, pressed sharp enough to draw blood. He walked past Morrison's table without a word, his boots leaving prints in the red dust. Hey, Grandpa, Morrison called out. You planning on entering that thing in an antique show? Might actually be worth something to a museum. Call it Exhibit A in How Not to Maintain Equipment. Webb stopped, turned slowly. His eyes were the color of storm clouds, set deep in a face that looked like cracked leather. When he spoke, his voice was low and measured, the accent pure Oklahoma plains. Lieutenant, this canteen kept my father alive for 13 months in the Mekong Delta. Kept my grandfather warm in the Chosin Reservoir when the temperature hit 40 below. It'll keep me alive here. Morrison stood, closing the distance between them. His smile was all teeth, no warmth. With all due respect, Staff Sergeant, we're not in Vietnam or Korea. We've got Camelbox, hydration systems, filtered water stations. That relic is a liability. What happens when you're out on patrol and you need water fast? You gonna unscrew that rusty cap with your arthritis hands while insurgents are shooting at you? The courtyard had gone quiet. Even the wind seemed to hold its breath. Webb's jaw tightened, but his voice stayed level. I'll manage just fine, sir. You'll manage. Morrison shook his head, playing to his audience now. That's the problem with legacy enlistees. They think old ways are good ways. They don't adapt. They become dead weight. His eyes swept Webb up and down. And judging by that antique you're hauling around, I'd say you're carrying about 20 pounds of dead weight minimum. Chun and 2 other specialists laughed. Mendez looked at her boots. Webb could have said a lot of things. He could have mentioned that Morrison had never seen combat, that his 17 months in service were spent mostly behind a desk in Germany before this deployment. He could have pointed out that the lieutenant's father was a congressman who had made some calls to ensure his son's record stayed pristine. But Marcus Webb had learned long ago that some battles weren't worth fighting. Instead, he nodded once. Yes, sir. Will that be all, sir? Morrison waved him off dismissively. Dismissed, Staff Sergeant. Try not to rust out in this heat. Webb walked back to his quarters, the canteen bouncing against his hip. Behind him, he heard Morrison's voice rise again. I give him 2 weeks before he requests a transfer to some supply depot. He's too old for real work. Inside his small room, Webb sat on his bunk and opened the canteen. The water inside was cool, clean. He took a small sip and closed his eyes. Tomorrow they were heading out on patrol into the mountains near the Pakistani border. Intelligence had reported Taliban movement in the region. It would be Morrison's first real mission outside the wire. Webb screwed the cap back on tight and set the canteen on his footlocker. The metal caught the light coming through his window, glinting like a promise or a warning. His father's voice echoed in his memory from 30 years ago, the old man sitting on their porch in Tulsa, this same canteen in his weathered hands. Son, people will always judge what they don't understand. Let them talk. When the moment comes, you'll know what to do. The convoy rolled out at 0600 hours, 6 Humvees cutting through the pre-dawn darkness. Webb sat in the third vehicle, his canteen secured to his belt alongside his standard-issue gear. Morrison rode in the lead vehicle, his voice crackling over the radio every few minutes with unnecessary updates that made the more experienced soldiers exchange knowing glances. The mission was straightforward on paper. Patrol the mountain passes, check in with local village elders, assess Taliban presence, and return before nightfall. But nothing in Afghanistan was ever straightforward. By noon, the temperature had climbed to 118 degrees. The convoy stopped at a checkpoint where Morrison insisted on inspecting every vehicle personally. Despite the protests of Sergeant First Class Robert Hayes, who had been running these routes for 3 tours. Hayes approached Morrison, his voice low. "Sir, we need to keep moving. The longer we sit here, the more exposed we are." Morrison didn't even look up from his clipboard. "I'll determine when we move, Sergeant. Protocol exists for a reason." In the third vehicle, Webb took a measured sip from his canteen. Chan, sitting across from him, drained his camelback in 3 desperate gulps, then reached for his backup bottle. The private next to him, Jackson, did the same. Webb caught Chen's eye. "Slow down, Corporal. We've got 6 more hours minimum." Chun wiped his mouth. "Easy for you to say, old man. That thing probably holds, what, a cup of water? I need volume." Webb didn't respond. He took another small sip and secured the cap. 2 hours later, they were deep in the mountain passes when Morrison's voice came sharp over the radio. "All units halt. I see something." The convoy stopped on a narrow road with steep drops on both sides. Morrison climbed out, binoculars raised, scanning the ridgeline. Hayes immediately got on the radio to command, requesting drone support for aerial reconnaissance. "False alarm," Morrison announced after 20 minutes. "Thought I saw movement. We're clear." But the delay had cost them. When they tried to restart the convoy, the lead vehicle's engine refused to turn over. Overheated. The temperature had reached 122 degrees, and the mechanics estimated at least 90 minutes for repairs. That's when the real problem emerged. Jackson collapsed first, hitting the ground hard. Heat exhaustion. Then Chun stumbled, vomiting behind his Humvee. Within 30 minutes, 7 soldiers were showing symptoms. Their hydration systems had failed them, consumed too quickly in the brutal heat without proper rationing. Morrison's face went pale as he surveyed his incapacitated troops. He grabbed his own camelback, squeezed it. Empty. His backup bottles drained an hour ago. Around him, soldiers were checking their supplies. The math was brutal and simple. They had maybe 2 liters of water left among 18 soldiers, with hours still ahead in the killing heat. Hayes approached Morrison, his expression grim. "Sir, we've got a serious situation here." Morrison's confidence had evaporated like water on hot stone. His voice cracked when he spoke. "How did this happen?" Hayes didn't answer. Across the road, Marcus Webb stood slowly, his hand moving to the dented canteen on his hip. The rusty metal caught the savage sunlight, and for the first time that day, every eye in the convoy turned toward the old soldier. Webb unscrewed the canteen cap slowly, deliberately. The sound of metal on metal cut through the tense silence. He took one small sip, just enough to wet his lips, then walked toward the collapsed soldiers. Morrison stepped forward, his voice tight with desperation. "Webb, how much do you have left?" Webb held up the canteen, the liquid inside sloshing audibly. "Nearly full, sir. Been rationing since we left base." The lieutenant's eyes widened. "That's impossible." We've been out here for 7 hours in this heat. Webb knelt beside Jackson, the young private who had collapsed first. The kid's lips were cracked and bleeding, his skin pale beneath the sunburn. Webb tilted the canteen carefully, letting a measured amount of water flow into Jackson's mouth. Not too much, son. Small sips. Jackson's eyes fluttered open. Thank you, he whispered. Morrison watched, something shifting in his expression. That canteen holds what, maybe 32 ounces? You're telling me you've survived on that while the rest of us went through liters? Webb moved to Chun next, repeating the process. Old habits, Lieutenant. My father taught me that water is life, and life doesn't waste itself. You take what you need, not what you want. Hayes crouched beside Webb, his weathered face showing respect. Vietnam survival tactics? Korea, actually. Webb carefully measured out another portion for a third soldier. My grandfather was trapped behind enemy lines for 6 days at Chosin. Temperatures dropped to 50 below zero. He learned to melt snow in this canteen 1 capful at a time, warm it against his skin, make every drop count. He passed those lessons to my father. My father passed them to me. Morrison's hand trembled as he watched Webb move methodically from soldier to soldier, each getting just enough water to stabilize them without depleting the supply. The rusty canteen that had been the subject of mockery 12 hours ago was now the most valuable piece of equipment in the convoy. Webb glanced up at the lieutenant. Sir, this won't be enough for everyone. We need to make decisions. What kind of decisions? Morrison's voice was barely audible. The worst are stabilized, but we've got 18 people and maybe 20 ounces left. Webb's eyes scanned the surrounding terrain. There's a technique my grandfather used. If you're watching this and thinking the old man's about to pull off something incredible, go ahead and subscribe to the channel, because what happens next will surprise everyone here, including the lieutenant who called this canteen a piece of junk. Hayes raised an eyebrow. Webb, what are you thinking? Webb stood, moving toward the rocky outcrop beside the road. He began examining the stones carefully, running his fingers along the surfaces, checking for specific formations. The other conscious soldiers watched in confusion. Morrison followed him. What are you doing? We need water, not geology lessons. Webb didn't answer. His hands moved with practiced precision, finally stopping at a particular section of rock. He pulled out his combat knife and began scraping at a greenish-white crust forming along a crack in the stone. This, Lieutenant, is how you turn a useless trick into survival. Webb scraped the mineral deposits into his canteen with methodical precision. The white-green crust flaked off in small chunks, dissolving slowly in the remaining water. Morrison and Hayes crowded closer, watching with a mixture of confusion and desperate hope. What is that? Morrison asked, his earlier arrogance completely gone. Potassium nitrate deposits. Webb continued scraping. In extreme heat, these mountains sweat minerals through the rock. My grandfather learned it from a Korean villager who saved his unit. You mix it with water in specific ratios, it creates a chemical reaction that purifies and multiplies your hydration capacity at the cellular level. Hayes looked skeptical but desperate. That actually works? Saved my grandfather's entire platoon at Chosin. Saved my father's squad in the Mekong when they were cut off from supply lines for 11 days. Webb sealed the canteen and began shaking it vigorously. The key is the ratio and the container. Modern plastics leach chemicals that corrupt the process. You need old metal properly seasoned with years of use. That rust everyone mocked? It's actually oxidized iron that catalyzes the reaction. Morrison watched the canteen, his jaw tight. How long does it take? 15 minutes in this heat. Webb set the canteen on a flat rock in direct sunlight. While we wait, we need to prepare the men. Hayes, get everyone in the shade of the vehicles. Strip them down to reduce heat retention. Use the ponchos to create better cover. Hayes immediately started barking orders. The able-bodied soldiers moved with renewed purpose, suddenly looking at Webb not as the old fossil but as their lifeline. Chun, still weak but conscious, crawled closer to Webb. You're serious? That canteen is going to save us? Webb's expression was unreadable. That canteen, Corporal, represents 3 generations of soldiers who refused to quit. My grandfather could have died in Korea. My father could have died in Vietnam. I could have stayed on my farm and drunk myself to death after my wife passed. But we're all still here in one way or another because we learned that survival isn't about having the newest gear. It's about respecting what works. The 15 minutes felt like hours. Morrison sat apart from his men, his confident facade completely shattered. He kept glancing at Webb, then at his own expensive tactical gear, then back at the battered canteen heating in the sun. Finally, Webb lifted the canteen. The metal was almost too hot to touch. He wrapped it in cloth and carefully unscrewed the cap. The smell that emerged was sharp, mineral-rich, nothing like regular water. He took a small sip first, testing it. His eyes closed for a moment. Then he nodded. Perfect ratio. What happened next stunned everyone. Webb began pouring the liquid into canteen cups, and impossibly, the flow didn't stop. 1 cup became 2, 2 became 4. The chemical reaction had somehow expanded the water volume exponentially. It defied logic, defied science as Morrison understood it, but it was happening. Hayes stared. How much did you make? Webb kept pouring. Enough for everyone to make it home, Sergeant. Enough for everyone to make it home. The water tasted bitter, metallic, nothing like the filtered supply they had grown accustomed to at base. But to the dehydrated soldiers lying in the shade of the Humvees, it was salvation in liquid form. Webb moved among them like a combat medic, ensuring each man received the precise amount needed for recovery without overloading their systems. Jackson sat up after his 3rd cup, color returning to his face. Staff Sergeant, I don't understand the science, but I'm alive because of you. Webb handed him another measured portion. Science isn't always about understanding private. Sometimes it's about trusting what's been proven through blood and survival. Within an hour, all 7 collapsed soldiers were back on their feet. The lead vehicle's engine had cooled enough to restart. Hayes organized the convoy for departure, his commands sharp and efficient, but his eyes kept drifting to Webb with newfound respect. Morrison approached Webb as the men prepared to move out. The lieutenant's face was drawn, his earlier cockiness replaced by something that looked like shame. Staff Sergeant, I need to say something. Webb secured his canteen to his belt, the metal still warm from the sun. Sir, we should focus on getting everyone home safe. No. Morrison's voice was firm now, but different than before. Not commanding, but resolved. I was wrong. About you, about that canteen, about everything. I let my ego and my inexperience put these men at risk. You saved lives today that I nearly got killed through my own stupidity. The other soldiers had stopped loading equipment, watching the exchange. Morrison continued, louder now so everyone could hear. I called you dead weight. I mocked your experience. I treated you like a relic that didn't belong here. But the truth is, I'm the one who didn't belong. I came out here thinking my West Point degree and my youth made me superior. He gestured at the mountains around them. This place doesn't care about my resume. Cares about who knows how to survive. Webb's expression softened slightly. Lieutenant, every soldier starts somewhere. Today was a hard lesson, but you kept your men together when it mattered. That counts for something. Morrison shook his head. You kept them together, Staff Sergeant. With a rusty canteen and knowledge passed down through generations. He extended his hand. I'm requesting that you take point advisory on all future patrols. If you're willing to serve under an officer who has a lot to learn. Webb gripped Morrison's hand firmly. I'm willing, sir. The convoy rumbled back toward base as the sun began its descent toward the horizon. Inside the 3rd Humvee, Chun sat across from Webb, staring at the canteen with something approaching reverence. Can I ask you something, Staff Sergeant? Chen's voice was quiet. Why didn't you tell us before? About what that canteen could do? Webb looked out at the passing desert landscape, his weathered face thoughtful. Would you have believed me, Corporal? Or would you have laughed harder? Chen had no answer. The truth hung in the air between them, heavy as the heat they had just survived. 18 months later, forward operating base Sentinel looked different under the spring sky. The temperature had dropped to a manageable 90 degrees, and the base was alive with activity as troops prepared for the final withdrawal from the region. Captain Jake Morrison stood in the command center, 3 rows of ribbons on his chest that hadn't been there before, including a Bronze Star for actions during a firefight 6 months prior. He had grown into his rank, his confidence now tempered with hard-earned wisdom and genuine respect for the soldiers under his command. He walked across the courtyard to where Staff Sergeant Marcus Webb sat in the same spot as that day 18 months ago, the dented canteen resting on the table beside him. Morrison sat down without invitation, something the old version of himself would never have done. "We're shipping out next week. End of tour." Webb nodded slowly. "Heard the news. You did good work here, Captain. Your men trust you now, because I finally learned to trust them." Morrison glanced at the canteen. "And to trust that experience matters more than equipment manuals." He paused. "I'm recommending you for promotion, Master Sergeant. You've earned it 10 times over." Webb's weathered face creased into something resembling a smile. "Appreciate it, but I'm retiring, Captain. This was my last tour. Time to go home, see if my farm still remembers me." Morrison felt an unexpected tightness in his chest. "The base won't be the same without you. The base will be fine. You'll make sure of that." Webb picked up the canteen, its surface still rust-spotted and battle-worn. "But do me a favor. Remember that the newest technology isn't always the best technology. Sometimes the old ways survive because they work." Morrison nodded. "That canteen should be in a museum. What you did that day in the mountains, it saved 17 lives. My life." Webb stood, tucking the canteen into his pack. "It belongs with me, just like it belonged with my father and grandfather. Maybe one day, if I'm blessed with grandchildren, it'll belong to them. Some things aren't meant for museums, Captain. They're meant to be carried, to be used to remind us where we came from." They shook hands, and Morrison watched as the old soldier walked toward the transport vehicles. Other soldiers stopped Webb along the way, shaking his hand, clapping his shoulder, some with tears in their eyes. The legend of the rusty canteen had spread throughout the entire base, then throughout the entire region. A story of survival that reminded everyone that wisdom could come from unexpected places. 3 weeks later, Marcus Webb sat on the porch of his rebuilt farm in Tulsa, Oklahoma. The canteen rested on the wooden table beside him, catching the afternoon light. His neighbor's grandson, a kid named Tommy who talked about joining the army, sat across from him with wide eyes. "Tell me again, Mr. Webb, about the canteen." Webb smiled, picking up the dented metal container. "Well, son, it starts with understanding that some things carry more than water. They carry memory, they carry legacy, they carry the knowledge that survival is about more than just gear." As the sun set over the Oklahoma plains, Webb began the story again, his voice steady and sure, knowing that some lessons needed to be passed down, generation after generation, rusty canteen after rusty canteen.